Hello viewer, Eric the Car Guy here. Behind me I have a 2002 Chevrolet Cavalier. I've made the determination that the water pump is leaking. And today we're going to go through the process of replacing that water pump. Now this one is kind of nice. It has, apparently there are two VIN codes for Cavaliers up through 2002. And what you look at is the 8th VIN digit. And it's either going to be a number 4 or it's going to be an F as in Frank. If it's a number 4, it's the older style 2.2 liter engine, which this is what this has. And if it is the F as in Frank, it's the newer style engine. So if you're doing this job, you may have a difference even though you have the same year and the same engine, well, sort of the same engine. But you have to look at the 8th VIN digit, and when you call up to get your water pump, you may have to give that information as well. So be aware of that. But really, we're just going to go through a parts replacement. We're lucky in that this water pump is not driven by the timing belt. It's actually driven by the front accessory belt. So it's actually a pretty standard, straightforward replacement. Let's start by opening the hood and taking a look at what we got. Okay, now as I said, the water pump is driven. Down here it's this aluminum thing that you can see here sticking out from the front of the block. Probably the most difficult thing is going to be removing those fasteners that hold the pulley on, because the new water pump won't come with a pulley. You'll have to switch that over. But I think the first thing that I want to try and do is just jack up the side of the car so I can get a catch pan up underneath so I can catch any of the coolant that's obviously going to come out. Also, I feel I'm going to be removing the alternator. So something else I'll do is I'll disconnect the negative battery cable because I'm not going to be disconnecting any of the electrical connections here. I'm just going to remove the alternator and set it to the side. And this will just be some added support just in case. But you know what? Whenever you're talking about lifting heavy things, it's better to be safe than sorry. Before I even get started, I see a problem, and it's this prop rod. I'm gonna have to work around it the whole time. So instead of using the car prop rod, I'm actually gonna use this. You can use a hockey stick, broomstick, whatever, to do the same thing. But this way I don't have to fight around this hood prop. Trust me, this is way better. Okay, we talked about removing the negative battery cable first because I am going to be removing the alternator. This is just a standard 8mm here. And try to get it out of the way so that it won't come back and make contact accidentally. All you have to do is remove the negative. You don't have to remove the positive. Remember how I said I was going to remove the alternator to get better access to the water pump? I'm going to do that, but in order to do that, I'm going to need to remove the serpentine belt. But just for the heck of it, I'm going to try and loosen those fasteners that hold the pulley onto the water pump now before I do that. And the reason is because there's still tension put onto it by the drive belt. So I might get lucky and be able to knock those loose now. If not, I have other ways. Now, as I said, I'm going to try to knock these loose ahead of time, and I have this really great long skinny wrench. These are 13mm down here. I've got a couple of sets. I've got one from Mac and one from Snap-on. These long wrenches are really great for tight areas like this because they don't have that bend on them. But I'm just going to try and knock these loose on the water pump. So it is actually starting to spin. If I can do that 2 more times, I win. I don't know what I win, but excellent. I'll still show you my other trick, but this is actually working out pretty well. Well, to remove the belt, we're going to need to loosen the tensioner. Unfortunately, the tensioner lives way down there in the back of the engine, and it's very difficult to access with all this stuff in the way. So, to make life easier, rather than trying to fight around all of this stuff, I'm just going to remove the overflow tank or the expansion tank that I just installed. In addition, I'm going to also remove the engine mount. And this is going to open up this whole area, and it'll actually give me better access to the water pump itself, so it'll make removing it a lot easier. First thing I want to try to do though, since I've got my catch pan underneath here, is I want to turn my steering wheel so that the wheel is pointed outward. That'll give me a little more room out of there because I'm going to have to get my floor jack under the vehicle to support the engine when I remove this engine mount. Okay, like I said, I'm just going to put the key in. My negative battery cable is out, so you know I can do this all day long and it's not going to do anything with the electrics. I'm just going to turn the wheel all the way to the right, and that's going to crank that out to the side and make it easy to, well, it'll give me a little bit more room under there. Right, now that I've turned the wheel, it's giving me a little more room to put this pan under, but I'm just going to move it out of the way for now because I'm more concerned about supporting the engine. When I take the water pump off, and I know that there's going to be, well, actually when I take the overflow off, and I know that there's going to be stuff coming down here, that's when I'll put this pan back in place. But just to help show you what I'm doing, I'm going to show you where I'm going to support the engine. I'm just going to take my jack, but I'm not going to jack up just with this because this metal can damage the underside of the engine. So instead of just doing that, I'm going to place a block of wood over the top of my jack in order to have sort of a soft buffer between the jack and the bottom of the engine. Probably right here under the oil pan looks good. I'm going to try to angle this in such a way to where my block of wood is going to want to stay in place. And I'm not going to jack the engine up. I'm just going to get it to the point where I'm supporting it and then stop. So right here under the engine and transmission, just going to get, there we go. And like I said, I don't want to jack the car up, I just want to support it. So now that I know that it's bearing some weight here, I'm good. And now I'll put my pan back in place. Since I know I'm going to be removing this engine mount anyway, I can see that the cruise control is also something that's going to need to be removed. So I'm just going to remove that now before I get into the rest of this. Okay, here's that 13 nut, and this one's a 15. Now that those are loose, I can just pick it up and just lay it out of the way. Okay, you can see how much room that opened up, and we can very clearly see the tensioner now down underneath there, down underneath the power steering pump. Next thing I'm going to do is take this overflow out. Now the largest hose going into the overflow is right here. And you've seen me do this before with brake lines, but I'm just going to take this and pinch off this line going to the overflow. And I'll do that to help prevent more coolant from spilling out than needs to be. I just filled it up with coolant. It was pretty low when I replaced the overflow. So the coolant that I have is fairly new. So I want to try to hang on to as much of it as I can. And one of the ways I'll do that, like I said, is just sort of pinch that off. That way it doesn't bleed out while I'm trying to get the rest of this stuff out of here. But I'm actually going to start by removing these lines and then this one. Now keep in mind, I just put this overflow on, so these lines are going to come off real easy. You may have to take like a screwdriver or a pry bar or a pair of pliers or something. I sometimes do this, is I'll take a pair of pliers and slip it down in here and then push this way to try to get things out. You know, if I was really thinking, I would have disconnected this here. Because other than that, it's going to do exactly what I don't want it to do and get in my way. This is actually my favorite set of pliers for doing this with because I've got that nice angle on them. And I'll just start with like a little twist just to break it loose. And leverage it off. And just to keep track of things, I'm just going to put this back onto the overflow where it was. You might also use a pair of channel locks on this. I just have these really beefy pliers that work pretty good. About to get messy. Catch me if you can, I suppose. All right, there is one electrical connection, which I'll try and show you now, right down here for the level. Of coolant level. You can just push back on that, and that should unplug. It's just a 2-wire connector. Plugs right into the bottom here. This hose over here, you don't need to worry about, it doesn't really go anywhere. So now all you have is this 10mm here, and you can remove the expansion tank assembly. This guy's a 10mm. I'm just gonna use a 1/4 inch to get this. There's this bracket in here that's loose. It's kind of tricky to get out, but sort of hooks onto that lower hose a little bit. You can see that. You can just pull that guy out and set it aside. The only other thing that holds this in is this little hook in the side of the fender here. So you should be able to just sort of pull up. Be careful not to break the plastic. I'm just going to set this over here so I can find it when I need it. You may not want to remove this engine mount, but I think it's going to be key in this process. I think it's going to make our lives a lot easier. Noticing my hose is sort of leaking on this electrical connector. You want to try to avoid getting coolant in electrical connectors, so I'm just going to move that guy up out of the way and away from any dripping coolant. Next step is I'm going to remove this engine mount. There's one there, one there, one there, and then one here and one here. And I'm also going to remove this fastener, which holds down the low pressure AC line. Now remember, I've already got the engine supported, so don't think about knocking this loose until you have the engine supported. But I believe all these fasteners in here are going to be 15s. One more note is I'm going to take these loose first, that way the engine can have some drop a little bit before I take the rest of these out. I should be using impact extensions. And I didn't do what I said I was going to do. I was going to knock these first. As you can see, the engine dropped quite a bit when I did that. But now I'm just going to get the rest of this engine mount removed. And the reason I did it that way is because, as you can see, with that engine dropping as much as it did, had I done these last, then this whole thing may have been moving around first, so that's why I did those first. That way I released all the pressure from these other fasteners and I didn't put them into a bind when I loosened them. Whenever you're dealing with heavy stuff, you really have to start thinking this way, because you know that the load is going to move as you undo fasteners. Also, keep out of the way, you know? Move this high pressure line out of the way. Careful with AC lines, you don't want to bend them too much, but you can bend them a little. Well, I'll get it back. But I got all kinds of room in here now. Let's have a look. Even with the engine not jacked up, I have all the room in the world to work to get this water pump out of here. But I am going to lift the engine to get this whole part of it up high enough to where it's even easier to access over here. Jack's already in place, so all I have to do is just jack it up. Now, be careful doing this, because you don't want to go too far, you'll start breaking stuff. So be real careful and listen. Listen for anything that doesn't sound right. So before we get too far into this, let's just take a good look at how the serpentine belt is routed. It'll be important later. There'll be a test. And that test comes when you go to try to put it back on and you can't figure it out. If you have trouble though, I got a trick. Now hopefully your vehicle hasn't been in a collision and had its hood replaced and the sticker is gone, but a lot of times on serpentine belt vehicles there will be a sticker similar to this showing you how it's routed. Now I have this real handy tool that has a 3/8 drive on the end of it, in the same way a 3/8 ratchet would have that drive on the end of it, and that's what I'm going to use to get into the tensioner itself. So I'm going to use this tool. But should you not have this tool, you can just use a ratchet like this. Okay, you can see right down in here, this is where that 3/8 is supposed to go. And you just slip it into the end. There like like that. Once it's in there, you're in there. Then you can just pull up on the tensioner. Or wait, in this case, pull down, sorry. And you just push down on the tensioner, and it loosens the belt tension fairly easily. Once I've got the tension off, I can just slip the belt off, undo the tension. I'll be the first to admit that there's probably no better time to replace the serpentine belt than now. It's just, well, we spent money on overflow tanks and everything already. But you can, since we're just doing the water pump, just remove the belt from up front here. You don't have to completely take it off. Just take it off the parts you need to take it off of for the time being. Here's a better look at that water pump with some light. Let's take this alternator off and get him out of the way. I'm gonna start with this 15 down here. Well, you know what? Since it's catching on threads, I'm gonna take the other two loose and see if I can just pull this out next. Once again, this one's 13. I'm gonna sneak around under here to get my other one. See if we can wiggle this guy out of here. May need a pry bar. I have a special one just for the occasion. It's got a nice hook on it. There we go. That's all we wanted, was to move them out of the way. All right, now we can see what we're in for. Here's our prize right here. It's fastened to the outside of the engine. And I'm gonna be honest, I'm kind of glad I knocked these loose ahead of time, because it looks like I'm gonna have to take this pulley off of here first in order to gain access to all the fasteners around the outside of it itself. So I'm glad I knocked those loose. But I'll show you my trick real quick on how to get them loose should you take the serpentine belt and everything off ahead of time. All right, so if I need to get these loose and I wasn't able to do it with the belt still on, I take like a stout screwdriver, or better yet a pry bar, and stick it down in between the fasteners like this. And that will wedge them into place. And then I'll take my wrench and grab the other fastener that I'm not on and knock it loose. So that's how I do it if it doesn't work with the belt. But it did work with the belt, so we'll just use this method to tighten them instead of loosen. Okay, let's get these fasteners out of here. Get them out all the way. Three, and I should be able to just pull the pulley right off of there. Ta-da! In the interest of keeping everything all together, I'm going to take those three fasteners. These are the fasteners for the alternator. This long one went in the front, going this way. The short one went in the back. Okay, I've got my new water pump out, and the reason I've done that is I want to see how many fasteners hold it in place, because I can't quite see everything down there. And I'm also trying to get an idea, just to see if they look similar, and they do. So I'll definitely do a comparison once it's off the vehicle, but I'm really just looking to see how many fasteners hold it on. I wanted to see if there was like a hidden one here, but it looks like there's just 4, and I believe they would be 15mm heads on those. I was wrong, they're 13s, and I'm gonna go for the lower ones first. That was really easy to knock loose. Maybe it's not leaking, maybe it's just loose. Haha. Keep an eye on their length. They may be different lengths. I got this other lower one. That one looks the same length as the other one. It's just got 2 more. I'm starting to hear coolant coming out, so I'm glad I got my catch pan under there. Also looks the same length. Finally, also looks the same length. Something else you want to do when you're pulling water pump bolts out is look to see if there's like RTV or something on the end of them. That usually means they go into the coolant passage in the engine block or something, and it needs to be reinstalled when you put it back in. I often clean off the old RTV first before doing that, however. Now it's time to get that guy off of there, and it's going to get messy. Just tap it a couple of times. Check it out, we're halfway there, except for the part where we have to get that gasket off. And for those of you who like to use RTV on everything, I want you to consider where this is located and how much RTV you use and how much you're going to have to clean off in order to get this to seal properly. So now I'll do a quick comparison between the new and the old, and they look identical with the exception of the way this is mounted. So what? You can see that there's a difference in impellers here too. This is obviously an aftermarket pump. I don't think that's going to make too much of a difference. See if it's loose. It spins freely. The new one's got a little bit of resistance to it, which is what we want. We want this one to be harder to spin because it's new. Let's get that old gasket off. It's going to be really difficult to have you down in here with me, but I'm just going to use a regular traditional flathead gasket scraper. And I'm just going to go in and just scrape off the gasket as much as possible, and then I'll probably see if I can get my angle die grinder down in here to get it the rest of the way. But you need to remove all of the old gasket material. And once again, if you're the type of person who uses like a bunch of RTV in a place like this, just picture how difficult this would be if you had to remove RTV in addition to this, because RTV doesn't come off nearly as well as just regular gasket stuff does. Sorry I couldn't keep you in here the entire time because there just isn't enough room, as you can see, but I've gone around with my gasket scraper. Yes, you saw me tapping on it with a hammer, but you want to be careful not to score the surface. This is cast iron, the metal here, so it's a lot more resilient than aluminum would be. If you're doing this onto aluminum, you got to be really careful about scoring. But I've got the big stuff off, most of the big stuff off. It's been difficult up in this area here. But I'm going to come back in with my angle die grinder and a roll-lock disc, clean it up the rest of the way, and install this new water pump. Start getting this thing back together. Okay, this is what I'm talking about. It's my angle die grinder. I have a roll-lock disc on the end of it. This is more of a coarse disc. I'm not too worried because it is cast iron. This will clean up nicely. If it was aluminum, I'd treat it differently, but it's not, so this is what I'm using. But this will help me get down in there. Other than that, you're going to be there a while. You might even get like a razor blade or something, and then maybe some sandpaper afterwards if you don't have air tools. But this makes it a lot easier, and I'm just going to use this. See, there's just enough room to get down in here to do this, but not enough room for you. Now you can see the fruits of my labors. Everything's all clean and ready to accept the new gasket. I cleaned it up with a little brake clean, as you could maybe see in that last little clip of the video. Now I'm going to prepare the water pump and attach it to the block. All right, now comes the part where I'm going to install my gasket on the back of my pump. And I want to do that for two reasons. One, because it's going to be easier to install this without the thing just sort of hanging out there on the side of the block waiting for me to install this. But also, like say if I go to do this again next time at some point in the future, the gasket will come off with the pump rather than me having to scrape it off the block. That's the idea. So if I'm going to glue it to anything, I'll glue it to the water pump because I'm going to toss this part anyway. If my Honda Bond's going to work at all. It may be done. Yep, got to get some new stuff. But there's a gasket adhesive that you can use to do this exact same thing. In fact, I would recommend a gasket adhesive over RTV to do this job because that's what it's made for. Fresh tube of Honda Bond, and just a little bit around the bolt holes. If it'll come out, yeah, just a little bit. I don't want a lot on here. I don't need a lot on here. I just need it to stay in place long enough for me to start running the fasteners down. That's it. I mean, and that's, honestly, that's all I'm going to use. All that right there. And that's all I'm going to need because, like I said, oops. All I want it to do is hold it so that the bolt holes line up long enough for me to fasten this onto the vehicle. I don't need any more glue at that point. I just don't. You're not frosting a cake. You're just putting on a gasket. So a couple of dabs here and there will get you to a place to where you can line the bolt holes up and fasten this thing down. Once it's fastened down, the gasket's going to do its work. Let the gasket do its work.